Hello and welcome. Today I wanted to start a little post discussion series, I guess, on just things like DMing and running a TTRPG game. This is something that I've been doing now for the last, maybe 5 years now, I think, something along the lines. I've had about two major campaigns and a few shorter ones here and there. Um, well, actually, no, three campaigns. I've got one currently, and two prior that I've sadly ended a bit sooner than expected, but still, I think they went rather well in some respects, not so much in others, and I want to discuss a little about that because I think looking back at what didn't go so well could be useful for going forward, and I've been told quite often by my players that it has actually been a notable improvement each time. So I want to sort of go back to the beginning really with it. So back a few years ago, it was also born out of perhaps frustration in some respects. At the time, we were struggling to get games in. The DM at the time, unfortunately, was not in a position where he could run quite a lot. And I said, well, okay, you can't at the moment, then why don't I give it a go? I'd played Dungeons & Dragons now for a little bit, and I had a bit of understanding. So I crafted a campaign idea, put together this, and based on my interest, I'll be very frank, I do like things a little grittier, a little darker. So I initially planned out this grand intrigue campaign, very political intrigue, very different factions and webs of people interconnected, and the party themselves had all sorts of secrets and plots, and were very likely to backstab each other as much as they were to help each other. This, admittedly, was an interesting idea. If I was to do it again, I'd probably have to put in a lot more work, partly because I feel these kind of things, and I do not recommend this as your first kind of campaign, by the way, guys. Genuinely. It's not the kind of thing that's done lightly. And personally, I think it's just perfectly fine to do a module, or just give a classical adventure. Honestly, don't do what I did, which was trying to forge a political intrigue campaign where your party had knives in each other's backs constantly, and betrayal was on the plate quite often. Personally, what I found from it was it creates a bit of a not the greatest sort of environment for everybody, where you had various people, for example, to sort of give you a rundown of the setting, essentially all the sort of noble kingdoms were either crushed or sort of overruled by these greater powers. One group was ran by a bunch of aboleth, who had beneath their mind flayers, who were brutal enforcers. Another by a bunch of giants who commanded through rule of law and had their Goliath sort of descendants be this sort of enforcement and the judges. And the giants would, rule by just an iron law and defensive walls, an oppressive sort of very doctrinal kind of society. And then the dragons with their very much, I suppose to describe it would be capitalist in a way, but also very much money hoarding, gathering of wealth, and dragons having the say on everything. And depending on what type of dragon, depending on what kind of power they have at their disposal, the size and power of the dragon and their horde essentially dictated their authority. And beneath them, other draconic creatures had authority if they were smart enough to have it. These nations, not the only ones. There's definitely the outcasts, like the drow merchants, who would ride around on these titanic spiders, and essentially were independent, along with many other smaller factions that all had various bits of power from Clan Rattus, a group of were-rats who had survived a great purge of various were-rat clans, who were a seedy underground who would take advantage of people's misery, and try and bring them in by infecting them through subterfuge and other methods. I don't remember all the groups I'd made for it at the time, but one of them that was quite relevant was Last Angelus, which were the last sort of bastion of good, the last sort of the Asimar and angels that had survived Heaven's fall. As yes, Heaven in my setting, had fallen. It essentially became a realm ruled by essentially old gods, these twisted, Cthulhu-esque kind of creatures that threatened to invade the world at any moment. And even hell wasn't perfect. It was certainly not the best place, but it was better than heaven at the time. And essentially, in that setting, being a cleric was almost a punishment, as you were bound to go up and thus be food. Now, it's a very dark setting, and admittedly, the settings I made after have been more hopeful. It's the thing to be careful of with dark settings is they need to have some kind of reason to keep going, even if it's just people's naivety. This wasn't the case with my first setting, and it was my first setting. I'm not going to hold myself too much of a cudgel on that one. It was what it was. It was a fun experiment and an interesting idea, and I've been told many times that people, players of mine, have wanted me to recreate it, and one day I probably will. I've definitely taken ideas from it, the factions being a big thing. I love the idea of factions. Various groups having power in various areas from, well, who controls agriculture perhaps, who controls the brewery, who maybe holds the red light district, who holds the mining, the industrial, these kind of things. It might sound boring to some of you, and that's fine. That's not how you want to play the game. Power to you. That's how I like to play the game. I like to run things. The players don't need to know any of this. They don't need to know what they need to know. And I tend to keep that just a public knowledge. I make a little lore sheet for them. If they want to read it, ideally they do, because I tend to make sure that knowledge of the world helps, and I reward them, I reward them with inspirations, I reward them with, building on that and going, yeah, very well remembered. Here's a bit more detail that you might have heard that might be relevant to the session that wouldn't be relevant in a lore document. But the issue was, with that campaign that I ran, I didn't quite know how to handle political intrigue, and I'd encouraged players to not tell each other their secrets. Personally, from my experience, let your players talk about their secrets out of character, and then let them look forward to the idea of it being revealed, and less of a paranoid kind of situation where they're worried about, these people are going to find out that I'm a necromancer or something, or I'm planning on overthrowing a local lord. Let the players know that. Seriously, let them all know that you're going to do that. And then they're prepared for it. And then it's almost like this, there's a bit of intrigue, a bit of interest from the player side. Because in the day, the players are having fun. Well, that should be the case. And if they're not, well, something's going very wrong. And I think the way it was run the first time impacted fun a little bit. And definitely on top of the fact that my pacing was abhorrent then. Things would escalate very, very quickly. And I felt that was because I was frustrated about how a few of the campaigns prior had felt very slow sometimes, and I now more appreciate the slowness, and I think, and I really stress this actually, try not to rush, because, let the players immerse themselves in the story, let themselves get really into it, because when the players are into it, you will really feel good as a DM. I strongly urge any up-and-coming DMs, please let your players get into it. Take the time. Don't worry if they take an hour RPing. That's fine. If they're having fun, that's all that matters. If you don't get through all your notes that session, well, fantastic. That means next session, you have less work to do. I cannot begin to stress how beautiful that feeling is when you look at your notes and go, I can just use the rest of that for next session. And you already have it all prepared, and you can relax a little bit. That is a beautiful feeling. Don't ever overlook that feeling. It's so good. And if it does come up in the session, hey. And if you need to make some changes or plans where stuff that wasn't going to happen till later is come up sooner, is already there. If it isn't, hey. Improvisation is a powerful skill to learn, and sometimes I found it to be a very fruitful endeavour. But we'll get on to improvisation another time. Going to my next campaign, this one was a bit more hopeful. This one was essentially a, again, similar sort of, well, this was very different premise actually, more like a classical adventure, but I had a tying thing with each player, a reason why they were a group. That reason would be, each of them were killed. And a lot of the things that were going to be antagonists for them in the various sort of arcs that planned out were the things that killed them. From vampires that become more feral. Think the Strigoi from Warhammer, if you're not familiar. think a more feral, brutal vampire that's more bat-looking and has lost of the madness. I also got inspiration from the Age of Sigmar interpretation of the Ghoul King, having essentially a faction of ghouls around them, former like soldiers, priests, just normal people, and in one case, an individual who eventually become more of a character, someone who, when she was first made into a ghoul, the king would feed her his own blood, and this would slowly make her more and more vampiric, starting with little wings in her back, and eventually turning into a full-blown vampire later down the road. The character never came up again, but it was certainly an interesting thing to sort of leave dangling there. And that first arc, I felt pretty good about it. It was a lot of the players trying to hunt down this elusive predatory force that had butchered two of them before. So they were very rightfully afraid of this creature that could move inhumanly fast and was inhumanly strong due to the vampirism. And it led to the discovery of another vampire, essentially manipulating this former, once baron, now monster's wife, into a vampire herself, and essentially throwing him to the wilds where he'd be affected by the true main antagonist, who would turn him into what he is now. An individual we'll just call the Lord of Pain. He lived up to his name, certainly. Bit of an edgy name, admittedly, now I look back on it, but it was more a title. But we'll get on to him later. This baron essentially recreated his own barony, but in a ghoulish fashion, fashioning a flag out of sort of rotten, blooded pelts, as opposed to the flag of a bear that the nation, well, his barony in particular, used to have. And essentially, the players found him eventually, after deducing how he was hiding from them. But it didn't come easily. They had a brief interaction with the Lord of Pain, who was notably far too powerful for them at the time, and I found I had to be careful how I demonstrate the main antagonist's power, because it kind of put them in a weird position when they encountered him later, where an event that was going to happen didn't, because naturally the players wanted to go nowhere near him. The reason they wanted to go nowhere near him was because he was able to throw them into the Shadowfell. Now, if those of you who don't know, the Shadowfell is kind of like a dark mirror of our world in many cases. It's where colour and emotion are drained away, and essentially they had to find a way out. It also kind of became a home for them later, and a useful place to go where time would go differently. So, essentially, a bit like the Chamber from Dragon Ball, interesting enough, but similar kind of stick to that in a way. Essentially, 1 year out here was 2 years in there. So not quite a day to a year, but you get the gist. Now, the players did eventually hunt down and kill this Ghoul King. And when they did, of course, I then had a year's break in the campaign. Not an actual year, but an in-game year. And I had each of them just give me a general gist of what they did. And you probably gather immediately from that, this went a lot better than my last campaign, where I just sort of stuck to my strengths, really. I had factions, but I didn't make too much intrigue. But I also allowed players to have their own things they wanted to do. Some wanted to develop the mana they'd acquired in the Shadowfell into this place where they could really conduct their work. Others wanted to make companies. The wizard, should I say, the only wizard there, the only caster there of the group, wanted to write a book called The Wandering Wizard's Guide. This book, ironically enough, has come up as a reference in my current campaign, as essentially the last campaign being written down as a fantastical kind of retelling. Now, this campaign sort of fell apart in the second act, unfortunately. I never quite got... Well, it got in the second act, but I feel like the second act is where things stopped working. Let me explain. So, the second act had the players gathering up in a nation that was more of a republic, rather than the barony, the more sort of traditional, sort of very medieval England kind of place. This was more like... the place had more of an aesthetic like Italy, I guess, sort of Renaissance Italy. And essentially they were accosted by a cult connected to this thing called the Collector. Now, essentially this cult would replace parts of their body with machinery in some strange magical, mechanical ritual. And in a sense, they'd almost be possessed by the spirits of other followers, or spirits that the collectors had collected before. Now, I keep saying collector. What do I mean by this? I refer to a creature known as a cadaver collector. A very favourite of mine. Essentially, a construct that would collect various bodies for necromancers. I repurposed this into being almost like a hive mind network of these machines that were connected to this mad version of themselves whose brain was harvested from someone else, and being this immortal wrecked machine body drove them mad, and thus all the machines connected to them mad with them. As essentially the setting had a empire that had collapsed into the various nations we have now, and this was one of their super weapons. This super weapon has now gone rogue. So the party now had to deal with this, and eventually on their travels, after they were forced out of the city by the cultists attacking them, they encountered one. Now, to go back on that, there was a number of sessions where they were within this starting city, and they were sniffing around, doing a bit of intrigue, and what I should have done was let them rest and discuss the matters, where they'd been to a manor and met various figures, including the sister of the vampire who had corrupted the Baron's wife in the former arc. Now, this, unfortunately, meant that things had been rushed along where the party fled the city, and I, perhaps foolishly, had them encounter a collector, and I demonstrated very quickly the collector's quirk. Now, this isn't in the base stat, but something I added to make it interesting. They managed to defeat it, making use of some old artillery emplacements. The issue was, and just for anyone wondering who knows about the creature, I upscaled the creature significantly in size, hence why they required some beefier hardware. Essentially, its unique quirk that I gave it was that they were essentially invincible. If you took one down, it would get back up again, and you were never going to keep it down. Pun very much intended. So, the collector then, of course, pursued them, and it perhaps let the cat out of the bag that I wanted to have a pursuer, where they'd enter a region and the collector in that region would slowly hunt them down, and if they stayed in the city, it eventually would besiege the city. And I gave them siege attackers so they could realistically burst through a wall. Didn't need to do this, but I made sure just to note for myself. And a cadaver collector is quite a dangerous foe. 30-foot cone of paralysing breath, fairly meaty punches, and they can summon spirits. Shades in particular, of course. This kind of meant the party was rushing around to try and figure out how to deal with this problem, and it meant a lot of plot points happened sooner than I would have liked. This ended up meaning the arc ended sooner than expected, and as much as I enjoyed the end of the arc, the grand fight in the factory that produced them, and the fight with the original collector, gave it a mythic phase as well, made it a fairly brutal fight. They barely survived it. At the time though, I figured things had gone too quickly. And by the third arc, a character change from one of my players, meaning that the third arc was sort of thrown out of wits a bit, because now the character who had been killed, the thing that killed them in particular, was now not relevant as much because, well, I hadn't killed the rest of them. Obviously there's that close bond there, and if any of you had a player change character mid-campaign, it is such a pain sometimes. Obviously if a player's not enjoying themselves, encourage them to change character if there's no other option. After you've discussed, what they're actually bothered about. If they really need to change character because they're just not having fun, fair enough. But one thing that you need to make sure happens is integration. Integration is really important. It can really be difficult for the group to accept a new, character in, beyond the fact that it's the same player still. But that character's got no history, no backstory. This was 2 arcs in, so it was really, in many ways, a difficult time to sort of bring them in. But I thought, okay, we'll give them an arc where they can kind of relax and deal with some of the other threats at the time, and then maybe introduce the third arc, having the main big bad, the Lord of Pain, be that third arc's villain. Now, I say main bad guy. He wasn't the main guy, in a sense that there was one thing above him, but he was the one that was antagonising them the most here and there, though he served a different master, a white dragon who had been essentially ascended to divinity, struck down, resurrected again, and then locked away, and was seeking to return to a full godhood. And this creature was actually tied to the wizard, who essentially had bargained his soul away, not knowing, being as the wizard was quite young, not knowing what would happen. The by say they were young, I mean the wizard's character, not the player themselves. And this would have been the big bad. But, unfortunately, never quite got there, and initially the players were going to fight one of the lieutenants of the Lord of Pain, a creature called Fugeth the Twisted, I believe it was, something like that. A sort of abomination of man and spider, essentially. However, it never really got too much beyond the first session of that sort of arc, so to speak, and I suppose due to a few reasons, felt that I'd lost a bit of interest in carrying on. Things just didn't feel like they were working out, and a few frustrations in the prior arc just made me feel like, well, I'm not having fun myself, and before things got bad, I just said, I just went into here, and I just left it canonically that the last main event for the party was the defeat of the Collectors. To leave it on a good note. Starting my current campaign now, and this one's in a city. Quite a densely packed city. And I did a lot of sort of crunching of numbers, not actual numbers, but more just a rough idea of how many people be in the city, what populations in the city. I really built up this city called Hitara. And I once again introduced the idea of factions. Starting from the tippy top, being like the prince, who actually was the governor of the city, sent there by his father due to, well, essentially issues the prior governor. And of course, it'd have his royal guard, the Knights Solist, who were Knights Paladins, specifically sworn to him and his royal family. Various noble houses, from the likes of those who controlled the gold, to more niche ones, like House of Inventors, but also that same house had elders who were druids, or another house that essentially was the head of magic for the region, except for necromancy, and a few others, like the ones that controlled the navy. After that, I had groups like various churches in the region, featured the gods, and the guilds as well. The guilds essentially being this new up-and-coming fangled thing where money could get you into a position of power rather than birthright or divine providence. And as such, there was a bit of a conflict between those groups, the nobility being the old power, the church also being an old power, but believing their authority comes from divine right, and then the guilds saying, well, hey, we have money, so we're going to come in on this. Meanwhile, the prince is trying to balance all these, whilst himself being not the strongest, and already tied to one of the noble families through his wife. The party essentially was thrown into a situation in a world where going between nations and between cities even was very dangerous. A creature known as the Beast would stalk the lands, corrupting and twisting nature into its whim. A laughing, eldritch god that was unstoppable in a way, but also limited in what it could do itself directly, though in times of great chaos it could manifest briefly. An example I gave to the players was a great gash on the city's massive titanic walls that went from the top of the wall to the bottom, and that supposedly the beast itself left it there mocking the wall, for it was not the first city it targeted. The city itself was in a land called Gordlon, a nation that had been existed for quite a while, a nation founded by elves, and as such very long-lived leaders, but also a lot of long ago made mistakes. The separation of the elves from wood elves to high elves and wood elves, as essentially the wood elves were the first. Drow came from the wood elves, going further into the forest and dealing with darker magics. The combo of that magic and that particular part of the forest, making them how they are. Though not to do with Lolth, to make one distinction with my drow, they're more to do with a goddess of strife, and their symbol's more in the bat. Though they still engage in a lot of blood sports, essentially their senses are dulled to a lot of the enjoyments and passions that other people can have, so to really get what they want out of things, they have to deal with things like blood sports, where the adrenaline rush is even greater. Not because they're sadist, but because of how numb they are, due to where they came from, and the magic they've dealt with in the past. Wood elves themselves, in that setting, are quite extreme. Every emotion they try to show through art, or dance, or music is extreme, so their performances are almost vulgar in a way, to someone who isn't used to their level of passion. Whereas the high elves are a bit more like you or I, in a way, though quite snobby and snooty, and they look down on those kind of things, but they definitely are more reserved. And it's them who made the main nation of Gordlon, and brought in humans and dwarves initially, the humans to populate and do a lot of manual labour as there were more of them, and the dwarves to build the great walls that their cities were acquiring, and by the mandate of the royal house, the royal family, they had every city build up slowly with great towering walls protecting them, and each district would be walled initially. Hitara, for the most part, has followed this, but some districts fall outside of this, but those districts either are well defended themselves, have their own wall, or are capable of being abandoned during the winter months, where the beasts from the forests that are tainted by the beast itself would come. I did a lot more of this sort of smaller detail due to the scale of the setting being on this particular city. And so far, I felt like, for the most part, things have gone alright this time. There are bits and bobs I'm not perfectly happy with, but so far, the intrigue around an individual whose nickname is the Old Wolf, who's the old governor of the place coming back, and his many myriad of connections to various groups, that of which I will not say here, on the off chance one of my players is somehow watching this. And if you are, shame on you for trying to get any information out of me. You'll never get it, not in a million years. But that's why I think I'll end it here for now, I think. I greatly appreciate anyone who's sat through my rambling and raving, and I sincerely apologise for whatever deception I've put on you to watch this whole thing. But if for some reason you like this, or like the idea of any other videos I might do on my channel, then please give it a like, maybe subscribe, and I do believe the bell's a thing as well, so if you're dinging that, and hopefully there isn't another bunch of steps in the next year or so, but you never know, it's YouTube. But for now, thank you very much for watching. I'm Baron Zarkar. Thank you very much. Have a good day.